Today we're going to look at some of the developments in English furniture during the reigns of William IV and Queen Victoria, a time when domestic virtues and material prosperity were top priorities, and even the dolls lived in snug and well-upholstered comfort. Now, by the time George IV died in 1830, the elegance and gaiety of the Regency period had disappeared, along with the supremacy of the Georgian aristocrats who for 100 years had been the arbiters of taste. With the knowledge and confidence bred in grand houses and fostered on the grand tour, they had ensured a standard of excellence in design that had never been equalled. But by the 1830s, the middle classes were already a social force to be reckoned with, and because they were also extremely rich, their taste, their habits and values had an important influence on the fashions of the day. The average newly wealthy man, and there were many created by the Industrial Revolution, not unnaturally wanted to show the world that he could afford the best money could buy, and the result was a great deal of vulgar ostentation. And when it came to a choice of style, he wasn't really at all sure what that style ought to be, and was therefore very much at the mercy of the manufacturers. The stylistic free-for-all that followed outdid even the Regency, and in Victorian times there were many different design influences at work. Now, just take this chair as an example. 16th century in parts, 17th century in others. A little bit of Jacobean, a little bit of Elizabethan. The Elizabethan period made popular for the Victorians by the novels of Sir Walter Scott. And exactly the same applies to this corner cupboard in oak. At first glance, it looks Elizabethan, doesn't it? But it's very definitely Victorian, made, of course, in the Elizabethan style. And up here, in this Romaine panel, yet another influence at work. Do you remember in an earlier programme when talking about 16th century furniture, we mentioned these Romaine panels as an Italian influence on the furniture of that period? Well, here it is, back again in Victorian times and repeated. And in the very same room as these pieces, you might well find this, a settee in the Adam style, decorated with paintings reminiscent of Angelica Kauffmann. This would certainly have been more comfortable than anything Adam himself ever designed. And the person who ordered this for his Victorian home was very fortunate in his choice of maker. A superb example of a Sheraton-style Carlton House desk, named after a desk made for Carlton House in the late 18th century, and a design for which appeared in Sheraton's drawing book. Just look at the craftsmanship in this, particularly the delicacy of the inlay work on these panels. This was made, probably, in the 1860s. The rest of the furniture might be Greek or Egyptian, Italian or French. Now take that brass stand, for instance, absolutely smothered in Rococo mounts. The Davenport is essentially a Regency design, but the Victorians liked it a lot and so used the design and developed it still further, as they did the Canterbury, which is a music stand, and you'll see many Victorian variations on the same theme as that. And so to this rather spindly-looking whatnot, and these turn spirals which support it are very reminiscent of the sort of things we saw earlier on Jacobean furniture. But this is not to say that as time went on, the Victorians didn't develop their very own style in furniture making. And this sideboard is typical of that, a massive symbol of prosperity and good living on which other symbols of prosperity and good living would have stood. The balloon-back chair is also a genuinely Victorian piece of furniture. It would be impossible to mistake that for anything than what it is, a Victorian dining chair. And the same sort of balloon-back design is used in this rather more comfortable, upholstered, button-back ladies' chair, it's called, although sometimes mistakenly referred to as a nursing chair, one of the few really elegant pieces of furniture that the Victorians produced. Now, this was known as a conversazione, very popular in Victorian times, and this incised decoration along the top here is absolutely typical of Victorian furniture. I must say, though, it's rather difficult to see how more than two people could have had a conversazione on that without getting a crick in the neck. And so to another really typical piece of Victorian furniture. This could only belong to the Victorian period. A heavy, solid, sober armchair with a button back. The coiled spring, incidentally, was introduced in the Victorian period, and this made upholstered seats even more comfortable. And in some houses, you would have found a chair or several such as this. They were made for the devout, made not to sit on, but to kneel on. And they took their name from the French. They were known as a prie-dieu. The style that best suited the devout mood of early Victorian England was the Gothic. Not the frivolous Gothic of the previous century, but the gloomy and portentous Gothic, eloquent of moral uplift, that had begun to appear in the 1820s. The name most associated with 19th century Gothic designs is that of Augustus Welby Pugin, who assisted in the designing and building of the new Houses of Parliament in the 1830s. This is the House of Lords, and this is the impressive Gothic throne he designed for Queen Victoria. Many of Pugin's designs were comparatively restrained, but the publicity given to his more spectacular efforts resulted in an epidemic of pinnacles, crockets and tracery applied without discrimination to all kinds of furniture, and which Pugin denounced over and over again in his critical writings. The Gothic style even reached into the humblest of pieces. This humble little piece is, believe it or not, an umbrella stand. Well, one writer who was anxious to improve standards of design was J.C. Loudon. His Encyclopedia of Cottage, Farm and Villa Architecture first appeared in 1833, and it was reissued no less than 10 times. Now, in this book, he is vitriolic about contemporary fashions, especially about the vulgar and grovelling taste of wealthy patrons who try to achieve a display of rich workmanship at as cheap a rate as possible. But he wasn't only concerned to raise the standards of the middle classes. He included designs for a range of cheap and practical furniture suitable for cottages, inns and servants' bedrooms that could be made by country joiners. Now, mass production was growing in all kinds of industry. The Victorians boasted that England was the workshop of the world, and in 1851 they mounted the Great Exhibition to show the world what they could make. It was housed in a building specially designed for the occasion, the Crystal Palace. Nearly 1 million square feet of glass were attached to 30 miles of iron framework, and the whole extraordinary edifice was put up in Hyde Park. The exhibition attracted 6 million visitors, and there were 15,000 exhibits of all kinds from all over the world. And there was, of course, a great deal of furniture, including a huge Renaissance bedstead made of brass, and something no home should be without, a dressing table that doubled as a fire escape. Much of the furniture was chosen to show off the use of new techniques and unusual materials. This stand, for example, was run by Jennens and Bettridge, who were just one of the firms displaying their products made of papier-mâché.
So here is some papier-mâché, and I expect everyone knows exactly what that is. You've all played about with it at school, probably making puppets and things, but it was discovered, invented actually in 1772. It became terribly popular after a decline, but terribly popular in Victorian times. There's some. Now, what's that look like? Just like a black and gold Japanese lacquer cabinet. Must look just like that. And even when the doors are open, it looks just the same. There it is, a nice interior, smothered with gilt chinoiserie. Just look at it. That, in fact, is papier-mâché. The surface is, it's all mahogany lined, and it's decorated like that over this layers of paper, laminated paper, and bears the firm's name, Jennens and Bettridge. And what a nice firm they were, because they saw the desirability of perhaps introducing paper, papier-mâché, on articles of wood. This is an ebonised cane seat chair, nothing more, but it has just that one little oval panel there of papier-mâché, painted with those lilies of the valley. Here is a papier-mâché chair. The whole thing is virtually paper. Each sheet applied on a metal frame until the required surface is reached, and then polished and finished with all sorts of things. And look at the way it's decorated. Someone's been to a lot of trouble to make that very attractive. There's no doubt about that. And trays, well, there wasn't a preponderance of trays. There were trays everywhere. And 10 thicknesses of paper usually was the number of sheets required before you got a tray like this. And when you got it, it was absolutely like a board. You could plane it, you could scrape it, you could do anything with it. And it has one great advantage: it doesn't warp. That's quite something. But here's a pretty thing. Now, by any standards, no matter what's this made of, just look at that. Now, who could quarrel with that? I'm beginning to like this stuff myself a bit because, well, this is nice. Look, see? A little lady's everything. Manicure set in there. One lifts up the top. Everything she requires for her dressing table. Lovely cut glass jars, pin trays, everything. Engraved silver tops, hallmarked, of course. 1849, just the right date. And see what happens down below when you open the doors. Little fitted drawer there. You see, what for? Jewellery. And the drawer below it is even more exciting because this is a complete thing in itself. A little writing desk. You've seen hundreds of these in mahogany and rosewood. Here's one in paper, papier-mâché. Absolutely beautiful. So that adds up, by any standards, to a very nice article. Again signed, Jennings and Betteridge. There's another one, doors open just the same. Different design with pillars. Here's a pretty thing. I like little caddies. I like them in all sorts of funny shapes. I like them when they're finished to represent something unusual. What about that for malachite? Isn't that a lovely colour? And believe me, on that wood, it is paper. And that is beautiful. And so is this table. The last little bit, but what a nice little bit to end with. Get away from the table and look at it. Take in that flat-shaped base, the leafage of the pillar, the column, and then have a quick look at this. Now, what about that for a picture? Fancy a man painting this. But this is layers of paper once more. One thing I did omit to say was this business of this shell. This is not mother of pearl. It is shell. It is not inlaid. It's a mistaken idea. The shell was put on, and then the surface of the background, the papier-mâché, was built up to the level of the shell. But just look, it's something to go out with, isn't it? Fancy just leaving you looking at a table like that. Oh, I'm beginning to like this stuff myself.
One of the great successes of the 1851 exhibition was the hand-carved furniture of what was called the Warwick School, who specialised in large narrative carvings on overmantels, sideboards and things like that. Now in the dining room at Charlecote Park in Warwickshire, this famous piece, which was made by Wilcox of Warwick, illustrates the resources of nature and the trophies of the chase. It was presented to Queen Victoria, who said it was a masterpiece of genius and skill, but alas, she had no room for it. The Warwick School were the forerunners of a reaction against the deadening effects of mass production, which was led by William Morris. Now, he was a middle-class socialist intellectual who dreamed of a world where, in his own words, men had employment that would foster their self-respect and live in surroundings that would soothe and elevate them. And he wanted to return to the medieval ideals of craftsmanship, particularly the honesty of design and construction. Morris's most famous dictum was, "Have nothing in your house that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful." In 1861, he founded a firm which he described as a company of historical artists. Their partners included the pre-Raphaelite painters Burne-Jones and Rossetti, whose ideals really had very much in common with Morris's own. One of their first products was wallpaper, some of it designed by Burne-Jones, some by Morris, patterned usually with floral motifs linked by scrolling stems. And they made furniture like this, based on traditional designs, particularly from Sussex. Philip Webb was the firm's principal furniture designer. Both Morris and Webb believed that furniture design should grow naturally from good craftsmanship and functional simplicity, and that it should never depend on styles debased by commercial exploitation. This didn't prevent them, however, from producing furniture which in the main could only be afforded by the well-to-do. There were others who began to bring their own personal approaches to furniture design. William Burgess, for example, an architect who looked to medieval themes for his interior decoration and furniture. This is one of the rooms at Castellcoch in South Wales. But his medievalism was more sophisticated than Morris's and was far removed from the spirit of the medieval joiner. This sideboard of ebonized wood was designed by E.W. Godwin, another prominent name. Now, he'd been very struck with the Japanese furniture that had been displayed at another big exhibition in London in 1862, and much of his furniture reflects Japanese forms. This piece, as you can see, certainly has an Oriental feel about it, and considering it was made in 1867, it's one of the most forward-looking examples of mid-Victorian furniture. Now, in the 1880s and 1890s, there were two important stylistic movements happening at the same time. The first was the arts and crafts movement, which derived its inspiration from William Morris's ideas, and the second was the Art Nouveau movement, which in different forms and under different names was establishing itself at this time throughout Europe. Even in this country, there were many different styles, but they all had the same basic philosophy behind them, which was to break away from styles borrowed from previous eras and to create something which really was entirely new. And sometimes, indeed, it's difficult to make a firm distinction between the influences of these two movements. The pioneer group of the arts and crafts movement was the Century Guild, founded by A.H. McMurdo in 1882. This is a small oak desk designed by him. In essence, it's a handcrafted piece along the same William Morris principles, and yet it has elements of what we would now recognize as Art Nouveau ideas. And this chair, which McMurdo designed as early as 1882, can certainly be seen as one of the first pieces of Art Nouveau. One of the most distinctive features of the whole idea of Art Nouveau you can see there in that free curving line and those seaweed-like swirls, so absolutely typical of Art Nouveau design. Again, Charles Annesley Voysey, who made this dresser, is considered to be an English Art Nouveau designer, but he was really much closer to the arts and crafts movement. The most celebrated Art Nouveau designer was Charles Rennie Mackintosh. Like Robert Adam, he was a Scottish architect, and also, like Adam, he believed that the design of a room should convey the impression of a harmonious whole. He avoided any reference to historical styles, and his highly personal brand of Art Nouveau, based on geometrical designs, particularly the cube, must be considered as a major influence of the development of furniture design in the 20th century. He seemed particularly fond of white rooms and white furniture, some of it fitted, some of it freestanding. Many of his chairs had particularly tall backs, and this one, with a back that's over 4 feet high, is one of his most memorable designs. Well, from a very individual style of chair to a type that is more typically English than any other, and one which really came to the fore in Victorian times. It is, of course, the Windsor chair. Its traditional home is in the Chilterns, and, like generations of craftsmen before him, Stuart Linford, who has a workshop at Great Missenden near High Wycombe, finds much of his raw material near at hand.
Saplings like this in ash, yew and beech will find their way into his small workshop to become integral parts of the Windsor chairs he produces by traditional hand methods in several equally traditional styles. After the bark is roughly stripped away with a draw knife, this sapling will be bent to make an arm bow or back bow for a chair. But before the wood is pliable enough to be bent, it must spend up to 3 hours in the steamer. In Stuart's case, a rather Heath Robinson contraption, which is nonetheless very effective. It's fed by a drum of water, which is kept boiling on the workshop stove. And in a workshop like this, there's no shortage of fuel. Probably the most physically taxing part of the process is the shaping of the familiar saddled seat, which is done with a razor-sharp bottomer's adze. The 2-inch thick elm seat must be reduced in some places by over an inch. The final shape is most important to the comfort of the eventual sitter, and the travashing knife leaves a smooth, curved finish. The holes for the legs have to be bored at exactly the right angle, and here Stuart demonstrates the efficiency of the spoon bit and brace. Though it's long been a museum piece, it still does a perfect job. This type of bit starts easily at any angle and produces a smooth, clean hole. Meanwhile, the fire has kept the saplings steaming away. Once out of the steamer, they cool quickly, so the forming around the bending block has to be done immediately. It's another hard job, and one which is frequently disappointing. Often only 3 or 4 saplings out of every 10 survive the bending process to become the arm bow or the back bow of a chair. This one was successful, and it must be kept bent like this for 10 to 14 days to ensure that it retains its new shape. It's then thinned down with a series of spoke shaves to about half its original diameter. The one real concession that Stuart Linford makes to modern machinery is a powered lathe. The beechwood legs, understretchers and backsticks are all produced this way, decorated with their familiar rings and swells. Next comes the legging up, and as one might expect, traditional animal glues are preferred to more modern adhesives. And it's not just the whim of this particular craftsman. If a repair should become necessary later in the life of the chair, these joints can be easily steamed apart selectively without damaging the rest of the chair. The beechwood backsticks are similarly glued into place, and the chair finally begins to take shape. Why is it called a Windsor chair? Well, one story is that George III, sheltering from the rain in a cottage while out hunting in Windsor Great Park, found a chair of this type to be very comfortable and ordered some for Windsor Castle. Unfortunately, that story can't be true, as a Windsor chair was mentioned by name in a document as early as 1724. Another theory, and one that's possibly more acceptable, is that the chairs made in the Wickham area were sent down the Thames to Windsor. From here they were sent on to London. In the Londoner's mind, they'd be more directly associated with Windsor than with Wickham. But certainly the region in and around what's now High Wycombe evolved as the centre of the English chair-making industry. Between 1800 and 1860, the number of workshops rose from 1 or 2 to 150. And by 1870, their total output had risen to about 5,000 chairs a day. That's 1.5 million a year.
And this is the very chair we saw being made, a fine example which continues the best traditions of English craftsmanship right into the 20th century. Well, next week in our programme, we'll be looking briefly at more developments in the first half of the 20th century, and we'll be discussing the state of craftsmanship and design and the place of mass production today. Until then, goodbye.